Hello boys and girls, today we're going to be learning about American artist Mary Blair. When we look at a work of art, I want you to think about the following. See, when you look at a work of art, what do you see? Think, what does this art remind you of? Wonder. Using your imagination, what do you wonder about this artwork? Mary Blair. She was born October 21st, 1911 in McAlester, Oklahoma. She died at the age of 66, July 26, 1978 in Soquel, California. Her education was she went to school at Chouinard Art Institute in San Jose State University in California. Her occupation was an American artist, animator, and designer. Vocabulary. What is a concept artist? A concept artist is an individual who visualizes and creates art for an item, character, creatures, vehicles, environments, or an area that does not exist yet. Concept artists work together with directors, modelers, animators, and visual effects teams to help these ideas come to life. For instance, if we look at the top of this photo where it says before, this is a concept drawing that Mary Blair, the artist, created for the story Alice in Wonderland. Below is what the final product looks like. Objective. Today we will create our own cityscape inspired by American artist Mary Blair. Materials needed. You will need paper and something to draw with. Optional materials. These are going to be materials that you will need or can use to add color to your artwork. These can be crayons, pencils, watercolor paint, markers, paper towels, paintbrush, and water cup if you're using paint. Vocabulary. Today we're going to learn what a landscape is. A landscape is an artwork of nature and the land such as the ocean, mountains, trees, and sky. We're also going to learn about cityscape. Cityscape is an artistic representation of a city. Also, in purple we see the word oil resist. This is a process of drawing with oil pastels or crayons and painting over with watercolor paints. Resist means that the crayon will repel the watercolor away from it. First, let's look at some photographs of cityscapes. Here's a photograph of Hong Kong, China. We see here some details of landscapes like the sky, the mountains, and the water in the foreground. We also see some details of cityscape like the Ferris wheel and the tall buildings. We also see some buildings off in the background on top of the mountain. San Antonio, Texas. You'll notice here that there are some recognizable buildings in our own cityscape in our city. For example, over here to the left, we see the big red enchilada, which is the Central Library of San Antonio. We also see the Tower of the Americas in the middle. We can also see different buildings in different shapes, as well as the highway in the middle of the artwork. Now let's look at some photos of It's a Small World ride to get some more inspiration for our cityscape. Here are some details of Mary Blair's original concept art. Now let's look at what it looks like in real life. Here's a photograph from Tokyo, Japan in Disneyland of It's a Small World. Here's another photograph of Disneyland in Anaheim, California in the United States. This is the original It's a Small World ride that Mary Blair worked on with Walt Disney and his team in the 60s. And finally, here's a photograph of what the ride looks like inside. At the Magic Kingdom in Disney in Orlando, Florida in the United States. we see different countries pictured in this artwork. For example, I see Ireland, and I know it's Ireland because I see the green and it reminds me of St. Patrick's Day, as well as a leprechaun and a rainbow. We also see other countries like Spain over here and Italy off to the right. On the left side of the screen, we have the concept art or the sketch that Mary Blair, the artist, created for Walt Disney in preparation for his ride, It's a Small World. On the right side, we see a photograph of what the ride, It's a Small World, looks like today inside of Tokyo Disneyland, located in Japan. What I want you to do first is to look, use your eyes to see. What shapes do you see? What colors do you see? For instance, on the left side, on Mary Blair's original artwork, I see crosses, I see X's, I see arches below and above. I see diamonds. I see different sections of colors separated by shapes. So right over here we have triangles, circles. We have some tall peaks of the roofs. We have some short ones like over here. Now when I look at this artwork on the right side, I still see a lot of the details that came from Mary Blair's original artwork. For instance, I still see those colors separated by shapes. This time I see openings for windows. I see that the buildings are close together. I see that there's lots of different shapes. This time there's also numbers. I see a face in the middle. So there's lots of things that we can observe by looking at a work of art. In this artwork, I want you to think about what you see on my paper. For example, in our cityscape, we are going to need different sizes of buildings. Buildings come in tall, short, medium size. I also want you to think about different shapes. So for example, on mine, I see circles, I see triangles, I see arches, I see rectangles. I also want you to think about what parts of a landscape you can also include. Landscape are landforms that we find in nature. For example, grass, the sky, trees, a river. Another things that you can include in landscape can also be buildings, maybe mountains, the ocean, a volcano. There's lots of different things that you can add for a landscape. The first thing I'm going to do on my artwork is I'm going to separate the top of the page from the bottom of the page. Okay? But before I do that, since we are doing a landscape drawing, you want to make sure that your paper is side to side. In art, we call this horizontal or landscape. If you had your paper the opposite way, up and down, we call that portrait or vertical. But since we are making a landscape drawing, please make sure that your paper is side to side. The first thing we're going to do is create a horizon line. That's when we take our drawing material and start a line right across the page. Again, what this will do is separate the bottom of the page from the top of the page. For the purpose of today, I'm going to be starting with the crayon so that way you can see my drawing marks on the paper. I would suggest using a pencil first, and then you can go over by tracing over your lines. So if we look at this paper right here of my drawing, I have my horizon line right here in the middle of the page. So on my blank paper, I can start towards the bottom or in the middle, but again, I want to separate top and the bottom. I'm going to go a little bit lower than the middle because I want my buildings to be tall. Taking my drawing material, and I'm just drawing one line across the page. Okay, next, something that I want you to remember is the shapes that we saw in the cities, as well as the shapes you saw in Mary Blair's artwork for It's a Small World. So the first shape that I'm going to draw is just a large triangle. I'm sorry, a large rectangle rather. Something to also consider when you're creating these cityscapes today is that you want the buildings to touch each other. So for example, on my really tall building on the left side, I drew a medium-sized building, but I have them touching each other. Next to that, I have a building with a flower on top and a triangle, but as you see, I have it touching each other. You want to make it look like it's crowded together when you're drawing today. So for example, I'm going to draw a small building, but like I said, you have to make sure it is touching each other. Continue drawing buildings. You could do different shapes, different sizes. You can add stuff on top of your building, like different shapes. So right here, I'm going to add a triangle. Add different lines inside of your building. And this is going to help you later when you are painting or adding color to your cityscape. You want to have these different sections so you can add different types of color. So for example, on this building, I'm going to try doing a big letter X, and then some lines down the middle, off to the side, maybe some lines across. So when I'm adding color later, I can add different patterns of colors in each of these different sections. Don't forget to add different shapes inside of your buildings. Okay. You can add different details. I'm going to try and make the Alamo on mine. I'm going to start with a straight line across, but I'm not going to go too far. Next, I'm going to make a little bump. This is for the arc of the top of the Alamo. And I'm going to make one more bump here. Then I'm going to copy this same bump onto the other side. Straight line and come down. Okay. And then next, behind it, I'm going to try and add the Tower of Americas. But as you see, I have the lines touching each other. And then the tower has two long lines and then a medium-sized rectangle on top with a little antenna coming out. Now that we've created our cityscape, we've also added some parts of the landscape like the trees and the river and the moon up in the sky. It's now time to add color. But first, I want to show you an optional technique that you can do on this artwork. If you have watercolor paints and crayons at home, preferably a white crayon, you can do a process that we've done in the art room with oil pastels called oil resist. In this process, you can draw with a white crayon or a white oil pastel if you have any available at home, and then you will paint over it. When you paint over it with the watercolor paints, you're going to notice that wherever you drew with the crayon, it's going to resist or repel or stop the paint from going through. So for example, you look at my artwork here, I used white crayons to draw diagonal lines in the back of my cityscape for the sky. And then when I painted over it, anywhere there was white crayon, the watercolor paint stopped and it was repelled, so it didn't come through. I even did some white crayon over here in where the building's archways are. And I also added some white crayon, if you look closely, on the river for the wavy lines inside of the river. This is not required, since I understand not everybody has these materials at home, but this is just an additional technique that you can do. So for instance, I'm going to do the same thing that I did to my river in the previous drawing, where I'm going to be adding some wavy lines. Let me show you what that looks like on the back of my paper. So with my crayon, I'm doing some wavy lines for the waves in my river. As I'm doing nighttime, I'm going to add little white dots all over the sky. And when I paint later, these are going to be like the stars in my cityscape. Now I have finished adding paint to the background. Since I'm doing a nighttime cityscape, I did purple and blue. And then I came back over and added some more color to some buildings. And now I'm going to be adding the blue paint for the river. Now if you remember earlier, when I was drawing the river, I was adding white crayon for the oil resist. It's pretty much similar to what I have back here in the background for the stars. Okay, so I'm going to get some blue paint. And now I'm going to start painting over my river. And something I want you to notice that now we are seeing oil resist appear. So again, what's happening right here is those white lines are the wavy lines that I drew earlier using my white crayon. That's it, boys and girls. Here's an example of my nighttime cityscape inspired by Mary Blair. And here is an example of my daytime cityscape inspired by Mary Blair. Thank you so much, boys and girls, for participating today. Please remember to turn in your assignments with your photos or videos of your cityscape onto our Google Classroom so that way we can share it with the whole school.